virgin rancher led a lost native girl home. Next day, 300 warriors stood silent outside his cabin. The arrow missed his head by inches and buried itself in the wooden post behind him. Charlie Bennett froze halfway through, nailing the fence board, hammer still raised. His bay mare whinnied and stamped in the corral. The second arrow never came. Instead, he heard crying. A girl's voice, young and terrified, somewhere beyond the cottonwood grove that marked the edge of his property. Every instinct screamed at him to get inside the cabin and bar the door. He had heard the stories. Settlers found with arrows in their backs, whole families gone in a night. But the crying continued, broken and desperate. Charlie lowered his hammer and walked toward the sound. Happened as his hand shook. He was 22 years old and had never fired his rifle at anything but rabbits and coyotes. A break-up into a small clearing where Blackwater Creek ran shallow over smooth stones. She sat on a flat rock in the middle of the water, knees pulled to her chest. She could not have been more than 14. Her deerskin dress was torn at the shoulder and mud streaked her face. When she saw him, she flinched and tried to stand, but her ankle gave out and she fell back with a gasp. Charlie stopped at the water's edge and held up both hands. He had no idea if she understood the gesture. They stared at each other across 10 feet of running water. Her eyes were dark and wide with fear. Blood seeped through a gash on her leg just above the ankle. The crying had stopped, but her chest heaved with panicked breaths. Charlie pointed at his cabin, barely visible through the trees. He made a walking motion with his fingers, then pointed at her injured leg and shook his head. She watched him without moving. He tried again, this time miming eating and drinking. Her expression did not change, but he saw her swallow hard. She was thirsty. Of course she was. How long had she been out here? He stepped into the creek. The cold water soaked through his boots instantly. She tensed like a rabbit about to bolt, but there was nowhere for her to go. Not on that ankle. When he reached the rock, he crouched down slowly and extended his hand. She looked at it like it might burn her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then her hand, small and trembling, touched his. Her skin was ice cold. Charlie helped her to her feet. She bit her lip to keep from crying out when her weight shifted to the injured leg. He had to get her across the creek and into the cabin before whoever shot that arrow came looking for her. Or before her people came looking for him. She leaned heavily against his side as they waded through the water. She could not have weighed more than 90 pounds. Every few steps she would gasp, and her grip on his arm would tighten. When they reached the bank, she stumbled and he caught her before she fell. Back at the cabin, he kicked the door open and helped her to the only chair he owned. She sat rigid, eyes darting around the single room. Charlie grabbed a clean cloth and the whiskey from under his bed. When he knelt in front of her to examine the wound, she pulled her leg back. He showed her the cloth and the bottle, then pointed at the gash. She understood that much. She nodded once, gripped the arms of the chair, and extended her leg. The cut was deep but clean. Charlie poured whiskey over it, and she made no sound, though her knuckles went white. He wrapped the cloth around her ankle and tied it snug. When he looked up, she was staring at him with an expression he could not read. He stood and went to the water bucket, filled a tin cup, and brought it to her. She took it with both hands and drank without stopping until it was empty. Then she spoke. The words meant nothing to him, but her tone was clear. A question. He shook his head and shrugged. She tried again in different words. Still nothing. They sat in silence as the afternoon light began to fade. Charlie had no idea what to do next. The girl refused to lie down on his bed. She sat in the chair all night with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, watching him like she expected him to turn into a wolf. Charlie tried to sleep on the floor near the stove, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw that arrow flying past his head. When dawn broke gray and cold through the single window, he found her asleep sitting up. Her head had tilted to one side and a strand of black hair had fallen across her face. She looked even younger in sleep. He had checked her ankle twice during the night. The bleeding had stopped and the swelling seemed manageable. She would be able to walk in a few days if infection did not set in. But then what? He could not keep her here. Her people would come looking. They had to. And when they found her in the cabin of a white settler, there would be no explaining his way out of it. He needed to take her home. The problem was he had no idea where home was. Charlie started a fire in the stove and put coffee on to boil. The smell woke her. She jerked upright and looked around wildly before remembering where she was. When she saw him at the stove, she relaxed slightly. He poured coffee into 2 cups and brought one to her. She sniffed it suspiciously, then took a careful sip. Her face wrinkled at the bitterness, but she drank more. He fried eggs and the last of his bacon. She ate with her fingers, quickly and efficiently, like someone who did not know when the next meal might come. When she finished, she set the plate aside and spoke again. This time she pointed out the window toward the northwest and made a sweeping gesture. Charlie understood. That was the direction she needed to go. He nodded and pointed at her ankle, then shook his head. Not yet. She frowned but did not argue. For 3 days, they existed in careful silence. He went about his work on the ranch while she stayed in the cabin. He brought her water and food. She watched him constantly. On the morning of the 4th day, she stood without help and walked to the door. Her limp was pronounced, but she could move. She turned to him and pointed northwest again. Charlie knew he could not put it off any longer. He saddled his mare and helped the girl up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, and he felt her stiffen at the contact, but she held on. They rode for hours through country Charlie barely knew. The girl would occasionally tap his shoulder and point, guiding him around rocky outcroppings and through passes he would have missed. The land rose steadily into foothills covered with pine and scrub oak. By afternoon they reached a broad valley with a river running through it. The girl's grip tightened. She spoke urgently and pointed toward a cluster of hide dwellings on the far side of the valley. Charlie's stomach turned to ice. There had to be 50 lodges down there. Maybe more. Smoke rose from cooking fires. He could see people moving between the structures, small as ants from this distance. The girl tapped his shoulder insistently. She wanted him to go down there. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to turn the horse around and ride hard for home. But she had already slid off the mare and was standing beside him, waiting. She looked up at him and said something in her language. Then she smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile. Charlie dismounted and led the mare down the slope toward the village. As they got closer, he saw people stop what they were doing and turn to watch. A woman's voice called out. The girl beside him shouted back, and suddenly she was running, limping and stumbling but running toward a woman who had broken away from the others. They collided in an embrace, and the woman was crying and touching the girl's face like she could not believe she was real. More people gathered around them. Men with bows and spears, women holding children. They all turned to look at Charlie standing there with his horse, feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his life. An older man pushed through the crowd. His hair was gray and he wore more decorative beadwork than the others. He spoke and everyone fell silent. The girl answered him, gesturing toward Charlie. The old man's eyes narrowed. He walked up to Charlie and stood so close Charlie could smell the smoke in his clothes. They stared at each other. Charlie forced himself not to look away. Finally, the old man spoke. His voice was deep and measured. Charlie had no idea what he said, but he understood the tone, a question that demanded an answer. The girl limped over and stood between them. She spoke rapidly, occasionally pointing at Charlie or at her bandaged ankle. The old man listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at Charlie again for a long time. Then he placed his hand on Charlie's shoulder and said something that made several of the watching men shift uncomfortably. The girl translated through gestures. "Sleep here tonight." Charlie shook his head and pointed back the way they had come. He needed to leave before dark or he would never find his way home. The old man's expression hardened. He repeated whatever he had said, more firmly this time. It was not a request. They led him to a lodge at the edge of the village. Inside, they brought him food and water. The girl came to check on him once, accompanied by the woman who had embraced her. The woman looked at him with tears still wet on her face and spoke. The girl translated through more gestures and a few English words she seemed to know. "Mother. Thank you. Good man." Then they left him alone. Charlie did not sleep. He sat near the entrance of the lodge and watched shadows move across the hide walls. He heard voices outside, men talking in low, urgent tones. He caught his name once, or what he assumed was his name. Bennett. The white man. He wondered if he would see morning. He woke to absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of dawn, but the heavy stillness that comes when many people are holding their breath at once. Charlie sat up fast. Pale light filtered through the hide walls of the lodge. He had fallen asleep after all, sometime in the dark hours before sunrise. Now his back ached and his mouth tasted like copper. He pushed aside the entrance flap and stepped out into the cool morning air. Then he stopped breathing. They stood in a massive semicircle around the lodge. Warriors 3 deep in places, stretching from one end of his vision to the other. He counted quickly and stopped at 200. There were more. They wore paint and feathers. They carried bows with arrows already nocked, spears with stone points that caught the early light, war clubs studded with bone and metal. Not one of them moved. They just stood there, watching him with expressions carved from stone. Charlie's legs nearly gave out. This was how he died. Alone in a valley he could not name, surrounded by 300 men who had every reason to kill him. He thought of his cabin, his mare, the fence he had been building when that first arrow split the air. The old man from yesterday stepped forward from the line of warriors. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood 10 feet from Charlie. His face revealed nothing. Behind him, the girl appeared. She limped to the old man's side and spoke to him quietly. He nodded without taking his eyes off Charlie. Then the old man raised his right hand. Every warrior in that semicircle raised their weapons. Charlie's vision blurred at the edges. His heart hammered so hard he thought his ribs might crack. This was it. The moment before 300 arrows and spears turned him into a dead man who should have minded his own business. The old man spoke. His voice carried across the silent gathering. Charlie understood nothing except that whatever was about to happen had been decided long before he woke up. The old man lowered his hand. Every weapon lowered with it. Then, one by one, the warriors drove the butts of their spears into the ground or placed their bows at their feet. The sound rippled through the semicircle like distant thunder. Charlie could not process what he was seeing. The old man stepped closer. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a necklace made of bear claws and blue beads.
He held it out toward Charlie.
The girl limped forward and took it, then brought it to Charlie. She placed it in his hands and closed his fingers around it. Her eyes were bright. When she spoke, her voice shook. "Brother." The word hung in the air between them. She said it again and touched her chest, then his. "Brother." The old man spoke again, longer this time. The girl translated haltingly, mixing gestures with broken English words. Charlie pieced it together. The girl was the old man's granddaughter. She had been gathering herbs near the creek when a mountain lion attacked. Iowa running, hurt her ankle, got lost trying to find her way back. They had been searching for 3 days. They thought she was dead. You brought her home. You fed her. You wrapped her wound. You could have done other things. Bad things. Men have done bad things, but you did not. You are brother now. Brother to her. Brother to us. The warriors began to move. They came forward in groups, each one stopping in front of Charlie to nod or touch his shoulder before moving past. It took nearly an hour for all of them to acknowledge him. Charlie stood there with the bear claw necklace in his hands and tried not to shake apart. When the last warrior had passed, the old man gestured for Charlie to follow him. They walked through the village to where his mare waited, already saddled. Someone had brushed her coat and braided red cloth into her mane. The saddlebags bulged with supplies. The old man pointed at them and spoke. The girl translated. Food, furs, seeds for planting, gifts from families. For brother. Charlie tried to speak, but his throat had closed up. He managed a nod. The old man gripped his shoulder hard enough to hurt, then released him and stepped back. The girl came forward one more time. She reached up and touched the bandage still wrapped around her ankle, then touched Charlie's chest above his heart. She smiled that same smile from yesterday, but this time her eyes were full of tears. She spoke in her own language. Charlie did not need a translation. He understood. He mounted his mare and turned her toward home. As he rode away from the valley, he looked back once. They were all still standing there, watching him go. 300 warriors who could have killed him without breaking a sweat. 300 men who had instead called him brother because he had done what any decent person should do. He touched the bear claw necklace now hanging around his neck and wondered if he would ever be able to explain this to anyone. Probably not. Some things could not be explained. They could only be lived through and remembered. Charlie rode home alone, but he did not feel alone anymore. The weeks that followed moved like a fever dream. Charlie worked his land with the necklace hanging against his chest, the bear claws clicking together when he bent to pull weeds or mend fence posts. He wore it while he slept. He wore it while he bathed in the creek. Twice he caught himself reaching up to touch it, making sure it was real, making sure everything that happened in that valley had actually occurred. The gifts from the village sat in the corner of his cabin, furs thick enough to keep out the winter cold. Dried meat wrapped in leaves that tasted like smoke and herbs he could not name, seeds in small leather pouches, each one carefully tied. He planted them near the cabin in soil he cleared himself. He had no idea what would grow. Life settled into a rhythm. Sunrise, work, sunset, sleep. He saw no one for nearly a month. His nearest neighbor lived 15 miles south, and they had spoken maybe twice in the year since Charlie bought the land. The isolation had never bothered him before. Now it felt different, heavier. He kept thinking about the girl. Not in any improper way, but wondering if her ankle had healed right. If she still limped. If she thought about that day at all. One morning in late summer, Charlie was hauling water from the creek when he heard horses. 3 riders came over the ridge to the east, moving fast. He recognized the lead rider even at a distance. Frank Murphy owned the biggest ranch in the territory. He employed 40 men and controlled water rights that made or broke smaller operations. The 2 men with him were hired guns. Everyone knew it even if no one said it out loud. Charlie set down the water buckets and waited. Murphy pulled his horse up short and dismounted without greeting. He was a thick man with a gray beard and eyes like chips of flint. He looked at Charlie the way someone might look at a coyote that had wandered too close to the henhouse. "You Bennett?" Charlie nodded. "I am." Murphy spat into the dirt. "Heard an interesting story about you. I heard you've been making friends with the savages up north." The 2 hired men spread out slightly, hands resting near their gun belts. Charlie felt his face flush. "I helped a lost girl find her way home. That is all." "That all?" Murphy's voice dripped with contempt. "You rode right into their camp. Spent the night, came back wearing their trinkets like some kind of treaty negotiator." Charlie touched the necklace without thinking. Murphy saw the gesture and his expression darkened. "You got any idea what you done? Those people been quiet for months. No raids, no trouble. Now they think they got white friends. They think they got leverage." "What leverage?" Charlie kept his voice steady. "I helped one girl." Murphy stepped closer. "That girl is the chief's granddaughter. You made yourself important to them. That makes you a problem for the rest of us trying to live here without getting arrows in our backs." "I did not ask to be important. I just did what was right." "Right?" Murphy laughed without humor. "Right is keeping your head down and not stirring up trouble. Right is understanding that there is them and there is us, and the line between does not get crossed. I crossed a creek. I bandaged a wound. I rode her home." One of the hired men spoke up. His voice was thin and mean. "Maybe we should make sure he understands the situation better. Maybe a few nights tied to a tree would teach him about community responsibility." Charlie's hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. He never reached it. Murphy held up his hand and the hired men stopped. "Not yet. I am giving you a chance, Bennett. You stay away from them. If they come here, you send them away. If they bring you gifts, you refuse. You cut whatever tie you made before it gets people killed. And if I do not, then you will find out how hard it is to run a ranch when your fences keep getting cut and your wells keep getting fouled. You will find out how lonely it gets when no one in town will sell you supplies. You will find out that being friends with savages makes you a savage, and we know how to deal with savages." Murphy mounted his horse. The hired men followed suit. They rode off without another word, leaving Charlie standing in his yard with his heart pounding and his hands shaking. That night he did not sleep. He sat in the dark with his rifle across his lap and listened to every sound the wind carried. When dawn came, he was still sitting there. A week later, the girl appeared. Charlie was fixing the cabin roof when he saw her walking up the path from the creek. She moved without the limp now. Her ankle had healed clean. She carried a woven basket in both hands. He climbed down the ladder and met her halfway across the yard. She smiled when she saw him and held out the basket. Inside were more seeds, dried berries, and something wrapped in leaves that smelled sweet. He took it and gestured toward the cabin, but she shook her head. She had not come to stay. She spoke in her language and pointed back toward the valley. Charlie caught maybe one word in 10. She was trying to tell him something important. He felt helpless and frustrated. He wanted to warn her about Murphy. He wanted to tell her not to come back, that it was dangerous for both of them. But how could he explain that in gestures and broken words? She seemed to sense his distress. She stepped closer and placed her hand over the bear claw necklace. She spoke again, slower this time. "Brother, family." Then she touched her chest. "Come. Anytime. Always welcome." Before he could respond, she turned and walked back toward the creek. He watched until she disappeared into the cottonwood grove. The basket felt heavy in his hands. That night he packed everything. The furs, the seeds, the dried meat. He wrapped it all in canvas and hid it under the floorboards beneath his bed. If Murphy came back and saw any of it, there would be consequences. But he could not bring himself to throw it away or burn it. 2 days later, his fence was cut in 3 places. The wire had been snipped clean with tools, not torn by animals. He spent a full day repairing it. The day after that, someone shot his mare. He found her in the morning, lying in the corral with a bullet hole behind her shoulder. She had been dead for hours. The flies were already thick. Charlie buried her beyond the cottonwood grove and cried while he did it. She had been a good horse. She had carried him into that valley and back without complaint. Now she was gone because he had made a choice that other people disagreed with. He walked the 15 miles to town to report it. The sheriff listened with his boots on his desk and his hat over his eyes. When Charlie finished, the sheriff tilted his hat back and looked at him. "You got any enemies, Bennett?" Charlie thought about Murphy and the 2 hired men. He thought about the girl and the 300 warriors. He thought about bear claws and broken fences and everything that had happened since that first arrow missed his head. "I am starting to," he said. The sheriff nodded, like that confirmed something. "Well, you let me know if you figure out who it was. But between you and me, you might want to think about whether this land is worth all the trouble it is causing you." Charlie walked out of the sheriff's office and stood in the dusty street. People passed by without looking at him. He had the distinct feeling that everyone in town already knew about the mayor, already knew about Murphy's visit, already knew that Charlie Bennett had become a problem. He walked 15 miles back to his ranch and sat on the porch as the sun set. The seeds he had planted near the cabin were starting to sprout, small green shoots pushing up through the dark soil. He had no idea what they would become. He touched the necklace and made a decision. The decision turned out to be staying. Charlie worked his land through the rest of summer and into fall. The plants from the seeds grew tall and produced squash unlike any he had seen before. Dark green and thick-skinned, they stored well and tasted sweet when roasted. He saved seeds from the best ones for next year. Murphy did not come back, but his presence hung over everything. Charlie saw his men sometimes, riding the perimeter of his property, watching. The message was clear. One wrong move and things would escalate. Charlie kept to himself and tried not to give them a reason, but trouble found him anyway. It started with a fire at the Hendricks place, 20 miles west. The family barely got out alive. Their barn burned to the ground with all their livestock inside. The next morning, someone found tracks leading away from the property, moccasin tracks. By noon, the story had spread through the territory like wildfire. The savages were raiding again. By evening, Murphy had organized a group of 40 men to ride north and teach the tribes a lesson about property rights. Charlie heard about it from a rider passing through on his way to join up. The man stopped for water and mentioned it casually, like he was talking about a barn raising or a church social. "They are meeting at Murphy's place at dawn, bringing rifles and rope. Going to burn out every village they find until someone admits to the fire. You should come. You know the country up there better than most." Charlie felt ice form in his stomach. The girl. The old man. The 300 warriors who had called him brother. He thought about that valley and what 40 armed men could do to the people living there. "I don't think that is a good idea," Charlie said carefully. The rider shrugged. "Suit yourself. But if you are not with us, people will wonder why. People will wonder whose side you are on." He rode off, leaving Charlie standing in his yard with his mind racing. He had maybe 12 hours before Murphy's group left. 12 hours to decide if he was going to watch innocent people get slaughtered or if he was going to do something about it. The cabin felt too small suddenly. He went outside and walked to the cottonwood grove. The creek ran clear and cold over the rocks. This was where it had started, where he had found her crying and hurt and alone. Where he had made the choice to help instead of hide. He touched the bear claw necklace. Brother, she had called him. Family. He could not let Murphy burn them out, could not stand by while people who had shown him nothing but honor were attacked for something they probably did not do. But what could he do? He was one man with no influence and no allies. If he rode to warn them, Murphy would know. Someone would see him leave, and word would spread. He would be marked as a traitor. His ranch would be forfeit. He might end up hanging from a tree by the time it was over. If he did nothing, people would die. People who had given him gifts and called him brother. The girl who had smiled at him despite everything she had been through. Charlie made his decision for the second time. He saddled the replacement horse he had bought after his mare was killed, a rangy gelding with a mean streak but good endurance. He loaded his rifle and filled his canteen. Then he rode north as the sun set. He pushed hard through the night, navigating by starlight and memory. The gelding fought him at first, but eventually settled into a steady pace. By the time dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold, Charlie had reached the foothills overlooking the valley. He did not ride down immediately. He stopped on a ridge and glassed the village with the small telescope he had brought. Smoke rose from morning fires. People moved between the lodges, starting their day. Children played near the river. It all looked so peaceful, so normal. Charlie descended slowly, watching for sentries. He knew they had to have them, but he saw no one until he was halfway across the valley floor. Then they appeared. 5 warriors, painted and armed, stepping out from behind rocks and trees. They had been there the whole time, watching him come. Charlie raised both hands and kept the gelding walking forward. One of the warriors notched an arrow but did not draw. Another spoke sharply. They were arguing about something. About him, One of them jogged back toward the village. The others kept their weapons ready and their eyes locked on Charlie. He stopped 20 yards away and waited. After what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes, the old man appeared. He walked with the same measured dignity Charlie remembered. Behind him came the girl, moving quickly despite the distance. When she saw Charlie, her face lit up. She called out and waved. The warriors lowered their weapons slightly, looking confused. The old man reached Charlie and stopped. He studied Charlie's face, then looked past him toward the ridge where Charlie had appeared. His expression sharpened. He knew. Somehow he knew Charlie had not come just to visit. Charlie dismounted and stood facing the old man. He pointed back the way he had come and held up both hands. Fingers spread, then spread them again and again. 40 men. He made a gun shape with his hand and pointed it. Armed. He drew his finger across his throat. Coming to kill. The old man's face hardened into something terrible. He turned and barked orders. Warriors scattered in every direction. Women began gathering children. The girl came to Charlie's side and gripped his arm. Her eyes were wide with fear but also with understanding. You came to warn us. Charlie nodded. He pointed at the sun, now climbing higher. Soon. Maybe 2 hours. Maybe less. The old man spoke to the girl. She translated haltingly. Why you help us again? You lose everything. Charlie looked at the necklace around his neck, then at the girl, then at the old man. Because you are family. The word hung in the air. The old man's expression shifted. For just a moment, something like grief passed across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the hard mask of a leader preparing for war. He gripped Charlie's shoulder once, hard, then turned and began issuing more orders. The village transformed. What had been a peaceful morning became organized chaos. Warriors armed themselves. Families packed essentials onto travois. The old man directed them like a general, his voice carrying across the valley. The girl stayed at Charlie's side. She watched her people prepare, and when she looked back at Charlie, tears streaked her face. We leave. Go to winter grounds early. Too many guns. Cannot fight. Charlie understood. 40 rifles against bows and spears. It would be a massacre. Running was the only option. But it also meant abandoning the valley, abandoning their homes. All because of a fire they probably had nothing to do with. He thought about the Hendricks place, about moccasin tracks that were too convenient, about Murphy, who wanted an excuse to push the tribes out of territory he considered his. The pieces fell into place. Charlie looked at the girl. The fire. At Hendricks' place. I do not think your people did it. I think someone wants us to think you did. Her eyes widened. She translated for her grandfather. The old man listened, then shook his head. He spoke firmly. The girl translated. Does not matter what is true. Matters what they believe. And they believe we are guilty. 2 hours later, the valley stood empty. The lodges remained, but the people were gone, vanished into the hills with everything they could carry. Charlie stood alone in the center of the abandoned village and waited. When Murphy and his 40 men rode down from the ridge, they found him sitting on a rock near the river with his rifle across his knees. Murphy pulled up short. His face went purple with rage. What in the hell are you doing here, Bennett? Warning them, Charlie said simply. He gestured at the empty lodges. You are too late. They are gone. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Murphy dismounted and walked toward Charlie with murder in his eyes. Murphy stopped 10 feet away. The 40 men behind him spread out in a loose semicircle, rifles ready. Charlie stayed seated on the rock. His hands did not move toward his weapon. You treasonous son of a bitch, Murphy said. His voice shook with fury. You warned them. You helped murderers escape justice. They did not burn the Hendricks place. Charlie kept his voice level. I think you know that. I think you needed an excuse, so you made one. Murphy's hand dropped to his gun belt. Several of the men behind him shifted nervously. No one spoke. I should put a bullet in you right here, Murphy said. Save the territory the trouble of a trial. Go ahead. Charlie met his eyes without flinching. But you should know that 300 warriors call me brother now. You will not make it back across the valley. It was a bluff. The warriors were miles away by now, moving their families to safety, but Murphy did not know that. Murphy's eyes flicked to the empty lodges, to the hills surrounding them. Charlie could see him calculating, wondering if this was a trap, wondering if those rocks and trees hid armed men waiting for a signal. You were lying, Murphy said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Maybe. Charlie stood slowly, keeping his hands visible. Or maybe you should ask yourself why I am still alive. Why I'm sitting here unarmed in the middle of their village instead of being filled with arrows. The truth was harder than Murphy's version of events. It required accepting that the people he had been ready to slaughter had shown more honor to a stranger than he had shown to anyone in his life. "You made your choice," Murphy said finally. "You chose them over us. That makes you an enemy. So be it." Charlie picked up his rifle and walked to his horse. No one stopped him. As he mounted, Murphy called out, "This is not over, Bennett. You will pay for this." "I know," Charlie said. He turned the gelding and rode north, away from Murphy and his men, away from the empty village. He rode for hours, until he was certain no one was following. Then he changed direction and headed for the winter grounds. He had been there once before, guided by the girl on that long ride home. He thought he could find it again. As the sun began to set, he saw smoke in the distance. When he crested the final ridge, he found them. The village had been rebuilt in a meadow surrounded by pine forest. Lodges stood in orderly rows. Fires burned. People moved about their evening tasks. They had done all of this in less than a day. The efficiency was staggering. Sentries saw him immediately. They did not raise weapons this time. One of them rode back toward the village at a gallop. By the time Charlie reached the edge of the meadow, a crowd had gathered. The old man stood at the front. Beside him, the girl. When she saw Charlie, she ran to him. He dismounted and she threw her arms around him, speaking rapidly in her language. Charlie did not need a translation. He hugged her back awkwardly, aware of every eye watching them. The old man approached. He looked older now, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He had just moved his entire people because of a threat they had not provoked, because someone else's greed had made them refugees. He spoke to Charlie. The girl translated, wiping tears from her face. "Grandfather says you gave up everything to warn us. Says you are true brother, truer than blood." Charlie shook his head. "I just did what was right." The old man smiled sadly. He replied through the girl, "Many people know what is right. Do it when the cost is high. You did. That is why you are family." They insisted he stay for the meal. He sat in the old man's lodge and ate venison and those same sweet squash he had grown from their seeds. They asked him questions through the girl.
"About Murphy? About the territory?"
About what would happen next. Charlie told them the truth. Murphy would not stop. He would push until the tribes were gone or dead. He had the resources and the men and the conviction that he was on the right side of history. The land they now occupied was federal territory, protected by treaties that were supposed to mean something. But Charlie had seen enough to know that treaties only mattered when they were convenient. "You should go further north," Charlie said, "into the mountains. Find somewhere they cannot reach easily." The old man listened to the translation and nodded. He had already been thinking the same thing. Before Charlie left, the old man gave him a gift. A horse. Not just any horse, but a paint stallion with intelligent eyes and a proud bearing. The kind of horse a chief might ride? Charlie tried to refuse. The old man insisted. "Brothers share everything," the girl translated. "You lost your mare because of us. This is small repayment for what you have lost." Charlie accepted the horse and the weight of what it represented. He rode back toward his ranch on the paint stallion as the stars came out. When he arrived 2 days later, he found his cabin burned to the ground. The fence was torn down. His well had been filled with rocks and dirt. Someone had salted the earth where his garden had been. Everything he had built was gone. A note was nailed to the one fence post still standing. It said, "Savage lover, get out." Charlie stood in the ruins and felt nothing. No anger, no grief. Just a strange, hollow clarity. He had made his choices and this was the price. He thought about the girl calling him brother. About 300 warriors lowering their weapons in respect. About the old man giving him a horse worth more than everything Murphy had destroyed. He thought about what family meant, and who got to decide. The paint stallion nickered and bumped his shoulder. Charlie stroked the animal's neck and looked at the ashes of his old life. Then he mounted and rode north, toward the mountains, toward the people who had called him brother when everyone else had called him enemy. He never looked back. The winter came early that year. Snow fell in thick curtains through October and November, turning the mountain passes into white mazes that only the most experienced could navigate. Charlie learned to navigate them. The girl, whose name he finally learned was Kimimela, taught him. She showed him how to read the land, how to find game trails and water sources, how to predict weather by watching the sky and the behavior of birds. He learned their language slowly, stumbling over words that had no English equivalent. They were patient with him. He lived in a lodge on the edge of the village, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough to maintain some solitude. The old man, whose name was Dakota, visited him often. They would sit by the fire, and Dakota would tell stories about the old days before settlers came in their wagons and brought their diseases and their hunger for land. Kimimela translated at first, but as the weeks passed, Charlie found he needed her less. The language was starting to make sense. He hunted with the warriors. The first time they invited him, he thought it might be a test. He was right. They rode hard through deep snow for hours, tracking an elk herd. When they finally cornered a bull, they handed Charlie a bow and gestured. He had never been good with a bow. His first shot went wide. His second buried itself in a tree trunk. The warriors watched without expression. On his third attempt, more from luck than skill, the arrow caught the elk in the chest. The animal ran 30 yards before collapsing. The warriors erupted in shouts and laughter. They clapped his shoulders, and one of them, a young man named Chayton, declared him the worst hunter they had ever seen with the luckiest shot in history. That night they roasted the elk and told the story over and over, each retelling making Charlie's incompetence more legendary. He found himself laughing until his sides hurt. When was the last time he had laughed like that? Not in years. Maybe never. The skills came gradually. He learned to track. He learned to move through the forest without sounding like a bear crashing through underbrush. He learned which plants were medicine and which were poison. Kimimela was his primary teacher, but others contributed. An old woman named Magaskawi taught him about herbs. A warrior named Nahale taught him hand signals for hunting. Children taught him games and insults and how to laugh at himself. In return, he taught them what he knew. Fence building, though they had little use for it. How to treat certain infections with whiskey and clean cloth. How to read and write English, which Dakota insisted the children learn. The world is changing, Dakota said through Kimimela's translation. Our children must be able to walk in both worlds, or they will be crushed between them. As winter deepened, news filtered up from the lowlands. Murphy had claimed Charlie's land for unpaid debts. No one questioned it. The sheriff had posted a warrant for Charlie's arrest on charges of conspiracy and treason. The warrant described him as armed and dangerous. It made him sound like an outlaw in a dime novel. One day a trader came through the village, a French-Canadian named Dupree who did business with the tribes. He pulled Charlie aside and spoke in low, urgent tones. You know they are looking for you? They got a bounty. $200 for information leading to your capture. Charlie absorbed this. $200 was more money than most people in the territory saw in a year. How many know where I am? Dupree shrugged. I know. Maybe others. But these people, they do not talk to white men. You are safe here unless someone follows you. No one will follow me here, Charlie said. Not in winter. Not in these mountains. Dupree looked doubtful but did not argue. He traded his goods for furs and left before the next snowfall. That night Charlie lay awake in his lodge and stared at the smoke hole in the ceiling. Through it he could see stars scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on dark cloth. He thought about bounties and warrants and the strange path his life had taken. 6 months ago he had been a rancher trying to make a living on difficult land. Now he was a wanted man living with people most settlers considered enemies. Now he was learning a language that would be useless anywhere but here. Now he was building a life that had no future he could see. He touched the bear claw necklace. It was warm from his body heat. Kimimela appeared at his lodge entrance and called softly. He invited her in. She sat across the fire from him and studied his face. She was 16 now, or close to it. Still young, but the softness of childhood was gone from her features. She had been shaped by hard things. Cannot sleep? She asked in English. He shook his head, thinking too much. About what? About whether I made the right choices. She poked the fire with a stick. The flames jumped and shadows danced across the hide walls. You saved my life. You warned us before Murphy came. You gave up everything. These seem like right choices. But what do they lead to? Charlie gestured at the lodge, at the village beyond. I cannot stay here forever, and you cannot go back. Her voice was matter-of-fact. So you make new paths. That is what people do. They make paths. Charlie smiled despite himself. When did you get so wise? She grinned. Always was wise. You just did not speak language well enough to know. She stood to leave, then paused at the entrance. Brother? He looked up. Yes, you are home. You just do not know it yet. She disappeared into the cold night. Charlie sat alone with her words and realized she was right. Somewhere between that first arrow and this moment, between a crying girl on a rock and 300 warriors calling him family, he had found a home. It looked nothing like what he had imagined. It offered no security and no certainty. But it was real, and it was his, and he would defend it with everything he had. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. Charlie finally slept. In his dreams, he saw spring coming. He saw the snow melting and the passes opening. He saw Murphy's men riding into the mountains with rifles and rope. He saw the choice he would have to make when they came, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, he was home.